compañeros y compañeras de la traducción. Bueno, la verdad estoy muy contento de participar de este espacio. Había preparado una presentación, no sé si es posible proyectarla, digamos, para que podamos avanzar. Mi intención es hablar básicamente de una foto que quiero que ustedes vean de América Latina y del Caribe, que es la foto que nos dejó la pandemia. Que si bien no terminó, ya sentimos las secuelas de 2 años que han sido muy duros para todos nosotros y nosotros. Esa foto la quiero plantear a través de unos indicadores sueltos que nos van a permitir de alguna manera entender qué es lo que está sucediendo actualmente en la región, quiénes han sido los más beneficiados de esta tragedia, porque aunque no lo crean, hay gente que se ha beneficiado y mucho de la tragedia que acabamos de vivir, que estamos viviendo todavía en todo el mundo, sobre todo en el sur global. ¿Y cuáles son las propuestas que nosotros trabajamos desde la región? Por ejemplo, para un impuesto a las grandes fortunas, que creemos sumamente necesario, y se van a dar cuenta por qué es absolutamente necesario. Entonces, quiero comenzar con la siguiente filmina, por favor. Como les decía, quiero poner una foto estadística, ¿no? Algunos indicadores que nos permitan entender por dónde pasa la región. Sobre todo porque en esta reunión no hay mayoría de latinoamericanos y latinoamericanas. Vamos a comenzar por la pobreza. América Latina el año pasado llegó a alcanzar el 32% de su población en niveles de pobreza y un 13,8% en pobreza extrema. Esto es gente que no tiene para comer y no tiene dónde vivir. Pero fíjense ustedes que después de la pandemia, en donde se registraron los más altos índices de pobreza, después de 10 años mantenemos niveles del 2010. Solamente hemos bajado la pobreza en ese periodo, en esa ventana que se conoce como la ventana de los gobiernos progresistas de la región. Ahí sí hemos bajado la pobreza. No tanto, pero ha bajado. En el gráfico de abajo ustedes pueden ver la pobreza expresada en millones de personas. Y ahí es donde la cosa se vuelve más compleja, ¿no? 200 millones de personas en América Latina son pobres y 86 millones están en extrema pobreza. Y esto está basado en datos oficiales, ¿sí? ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que seguramente debe haber un 20% que no se registra, un 30% que no se registra. Pero bueno, estos datos ya de por sí son bastante complejos. La siguiente, por favor. Y esa pobreza está basada en algo que es central, que es el precio de los alimentos. En América Latina y el Caribe, la variación del índice de precios de alimentos ha sido astronómica. De diciembre de 2020 a junio de 2022 ha crecido casi 7 puntos. En el gráfico de abajo ustedes pueden ver la línea más oscura, es el aumento del precio de los alimentos. Eso empuja a la gente a la pobreza, eso empuja a la gente al hambre. Y vamos a ver más adelante cómo muchas empresas se han beneficiado de este aumento de alimentos. Y además hay un dato a tener en cuenta. Cuando los alimentos empiezan a aumentar, cuando el precio de los alimentos comienza a aumentar, no había una guerra. Hoy la guerra parece explicar el aumento de los alimentos, pero en América Latina ya venían aumentando los alimentos, sin ninguna guerra de por medio. Siguiente, por favor. No estamos creciendo. Entonces venimos como trabajando en una cascada de situaciones. Tenemos altos índices de pobreza, tenemos altas tasas en los precios de los alimentos continúan subiendo, no tenemos un crecimiento sostenido en la región. Fíjense ustedes que estamos casi en niveles de cero crecimiento. Cero crecimiento, pobreza, aumento del precio de los alimentos, es casi un cóctel explosivo. Y las predicciones para lo que sigue son peores. Para el año que viene América Latina tampoco va a crecer. Y esto es realmente un problema para la región. Siguiente, por favor. A la pobreza, al alto precio de los alimentos, a la falta de crecimiento, le aumentamos la deuda. La mitad del PBI latinoamericano está contenido, está endeudado. Eso sí es una tragedia. Nos hemos endeudado para pagar las cuentas del COVID. La mitad de la región, la mitad del PBI regional está endeudado. Miren el caso de Argentina, 80%, el caso de Brasil, de Costa Rica, de Uruguay. Esto es la deuda total de los estados. Esta es realmente la tragedia, esta es realmente la pandemia, ¿no? Pobreza, endeudamiento, sin crecimiento, altos precios de los alimentos. Siguiente, por favor. Y lo peor para muchos países es que esa deuda está nominada en dólares. Y los países de América Latina no fabrican dólares. Tenemos que buscar esos dólares a través de la exportación y lamentablemente exportamos materias primas. Solamente materias primas, no productos terminados. Y más allá de que muchos dicen, bueno, vieron la guerra como una oportunidad para la región, porque si no hay materias primas en Europa, bueno, América Latina va a exportar y va a generar más divisas. Bueno, eso es crecimiento a costa del sufrimiento de otros, ¿no? Un poco como nos está pasando ahora esta diferencia entre el norte global y el sur global. Bueno, la mayoría de las deudas latinoamericanas de los gobiernos están nominadas en dólares. Ese es un gran problema también. Salvo Brasil, el resto tiene su deuda en dólares. Siguiente. A estas cuestiones que veníamos mencionando, la pobreza, los precios de los alimentos, la falta de crecimiento, los estados endeudados, endeudados en dólares, tenemos características de nuestro sistema tributario que no ayudan a morigerar esa situación, no ayudan a salir de esa situación. Tenemos una muy baja presión tributaria, casi 10 puntos por debajo de la OCDE. Tenemos sistemas tributarios absolutamente regresivos. La mitad de la recaudación en la región se explica por impuestos al consumo. Tenemos una heterogeneidad muy grande entre países. Esto es lo que se llama race to the bottom o carrera a la baja, ¿no? Buscamos permanentemente atraer inversión bajando impuestos. Y eso perpetúa las desigualdades. Eso perpetúa las desigualdades, porque no trabajamos desde los gobiernos, no se trabaja para generar el fin de la igualdad, sino todo lo contrario. ¿Y qué causa estas características? Bueno, una alta evasión, ahora lo vamos a ver, problemas de informalidad laboral, que la informalidad laboral una vez se tiende a pensar en los trabajadores que no tienen otra opción que trabajar de manera informal, pero hay que poner el ojo en los empresarios que contratan de manera informal. Ahí está la causa del trabajo informal, o una parte de la causa. Tenemos administraciones tributarias que, si bien están trabajando día y noche por mejorar la situación, no logran desentrañar la planificación tributaria de muchas corporaciones que trabajan con guaridas fiscales, con empresas offshore. Y ahora vamos a ver algunos datos de números respecto a estos temas. Un elevado gasto tributario, lo que los estados dejan de recaudar por incentivos a las grandes corporaciones. Cerca del 5% del PBI regional es gasto tributario. Es lo mismo que invertimos en educación. Es lo mismo que invertimos en educación. Y por supuesto, una alianza estratégica entre grandes medios de comunicación y ciertos sectores de la justicia en nuestros países que se resisten a las reformas tributarias, que de alguna manera terminan presentando reclamos ante la justicia y operando a través de los medios de comunicación porque se sienten sofocados por los impuestos. Algo que es absolutamente mentira, porque como ya vimos, tenemos una presión tributaria muy baja, hay una utilización desmedida de paraísos fiscales, es un sistema tributario absolutamente regresivo, y sin embargo las grandes corporaciones dicen que están ahogadas de impuestos, que están hundidas en impuestos. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, lo que se decía recién respecto de la diferencia entre la presión tributaria de la OCDE y la presión tributaria en América Latina, y ve que hay casi 10 puntos de diferencia, y es muchísimo dinero. Siguiente, por favor. La estructura tributaria que les decía es absolutamente regresiva. Acá está el caso de la OCDE, vinculado con América Latina, pero también con Argentina. Lo que ustedes pueden ver en color verde son los impuestos a la renta de sociedades y a la renta de personas físicas. Y lo que está en color violeta o turquesa son los impuestos al consumo. Ahí se ve claramente cómo nuestra estructura tributaria es absolutamente regresiva. Siguiente, por favor. Como les decía, algunos números. En términos de impuestos nacionales, la evasión es del 6,1% del PBI regional, casi 300.000 millones de dólares. En materia de flujos financieros ilícitos, cerca de un 1,5% del PBI, 93.000 millones de dólares. Y de eso, ¿qué perdemos en impuestos? La mitad, el 0,5% del PBI, 28.000 millones de dólares. Entendemos que la riqueza de los latinoamericanos, el 27% de esa riqueza está ubicado en guaridas fiscales, aproximadamente 945.000 millones de dólares. Ahí está la respuesta a nuestros problemas. Ahí está el espacio en el que tenemos que involucrarnos, en que tenemos que meter mano para poder resolver estos problemas de austeridad, estos problemas vinculados con la pobreza que les decía al principio, con la falta de crecimiento. Siguiente, por favor. ¿Y qué pasa con el gasto? ¿Qué pasa con el gasto público? ¿Qué pasa con la inversión social de los estados? Ha crecido gracias a la pandemia, ha crecido porque nos estábamos hundiendo, ha crecido porque estábamos al borde de una crisis humanitaria impresionante en la región. Y en algunos países ha crecido en protección social, en otros en educación, en otros en salud, en vivienda. Matti, la FTC ha hecho un gran trabajo respecto de eso, en qué rubros y en qué sectores se ha crecido en términos de gasto público y hacia dónde ha ido, con algunas sorpresas que ahora Matti va a mencionar seguramente. Pero esta es la foto. No ha crecido en la proporción en que tenemos que crecer en el gasto para terminar con la desigualdad, para terminar con la pobreza. Y acá, como les decía al principio, hubo algunos que se han beneficiado mucho. Muchos se han beneficiado de esta crisis humanitaria que ha vivido América Latina y el sur global y el mundo también por la pandemia. Siguiente, por favor. Y la pregunta es, ¿y los millonarios pagan? Vimos la foto de América Latina con algunos indicadores, una tragedia absoluta en la región. ¿Y los millonarios están pagando esto? ¿Pagan algunos impuestos? Siguiente, por favor. Esta es la evolución del patrimonio de los 1.000 millonarios, del de 2019 al 2021. Son todos datos de CEPAL. Fíjese usted el crecimiento exponencial en Argentina, en Brasil, en Chile, en Colombia, en México. Ha crecido exponencialmente el patrimonio de los 1.000 millonarios en el peor momento de la historia de la humanidad, por lo menos de la historia reciente. Ha crecido muchísimo ese patrimonio. Han seguido ganando muchísimo dinero. Siguiente, por favor. ¿Y en qué sectores ganaron muchísimo dinero? Por lo menos en América Latina y en el Caribe. En alimentos. No han dejado de aumentar el precio de los alimentos. En las finanzas. No han dejado de operar con guaridas fiscales. No han dejado de operar con paraísos fiscales. En el área de minería, que es el gran problema de la región latinoamericana. Ahí está la gran fortuna de los 1.000 millonarios latinoamericanos. Alimentos, finanzas y minería. Y casualmente es donde no podemos grabar impuestos. Casualmente es cuando queremos grabar impuestos en el área de minería o en el área de finanzas e inversiones, el lobby mediático y judicial es tremendo para que no logremos cobrar impuestos en esas áreas. Siguiente, por favor. Y ya voy terminando. ¿Pero pagan impuestos a la propiedad los ricos de América Latina? No, no pagan impuestos a la propiedad. Y si pagan impuestos muy, muy bajitos sobre la propiedad, casi nulos. No hay un revalúo fiscal de propiedades, de grandes extensiones de campo, y de campos muy productivos, que generan muchísima riqueza. Siguiente, por favor. Pagan impuestos a las herencias. Casi el 60% de la riqueza latinoamericana es heredada. No fue producida por estos 1.000 millonarios, fue heredada. ¿Pero pagan impuestos sobre esas herencias? No, tampoco. Impuestos muy bajitos, 0,12% en Brasil, 0,07% en Chile, 0,02% en Ecuador, para que tengan una idea de qué es lo que terminan pagando los 1.000 millonarios. Nada. Siguiente. El 1% de la población en América Latina concentra el 41% de la riqueza y el 10% el 72%. Desigualdad absoluta, plena. ¿Quieren una foto de la desigualdad? Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente. Sí, la anterior es para mostrar, la anterior, por favor, para mostrar el crecimiento de la fortuna de dos personas nada más, Jeff Bezos y el dueño de Facebook. Tremendo el aumento de la riqueza de esas personas, que tampoco es posible grabar. ¿Cómo está el avance de los impuestos a las grandes fortunas en nuestra región? Ya para ir finalizando porque me estoy pasando del tiempo. Siguiente. Dos para atrás, por favor. Ahí está. En Argentina una ley fue aporte extraordinario para morigerar los efectos de la pandemia. No se llamó ni siquiera impuesto a las grandes fortunas, para no herir susceptibilidades, me parece. Es un chiste este, ¿no? El umbral era de 2,2 millones de dólares. Por debajo de eso no pagaban impuestos. Se recaudaron cerca de 2.400 millones de dólares, muchísimo dinero. Y este impuesto tuvo asignación específica. ¿Qué significa? Es como se dice habitualmente, era dinero marcado. Se recaudaba para salud, para trabajo, educación y energía. Y hacia esos destinos fue el dinero. Pasemos a Bolivia, por ejemplo. La siguiente filmina. Bolivia, ley de impuesto a las grandes fortunas. En noviembre del 2020 grababa el patrimonio bruto con un umbral de 4,3 millones de dólares, con una tasa escalonada, destinado también a salud, compra de medicamentos, vacunas, destinado a educación, infraestructura, etc. Siguiente. Bueno, en el resto de la región, por lo menos en donde se discute, en Chile, en Colombia, en Costa Rica, en Perú y en Uruguay, también se plantea gravar las grandes riquezas como una alternativa posible para morigerar esta crisis humanitaria que estamos viviendo. Siguiente, por favor. Y ya vamos terminando. Nosotros planteamos gravar el impuesto a la propiedad, que como decía está subvaluado, y un impuesto a las grandes fortunas. Con simplemente eso, por año, se podría recaudar cerca de 24.000 millones de dólares por el impuesto a la propiedad y 24.000, 25.000 millones de dólares por el impuesto a las grandes fortunas. Es decir, que hay un mínimo de potencial de recaudación del 0,1% del PBI con solamente revisar la propiedad inmobiliaria y el impuesto a las grandes fortunas. Y quiero cerrar con un ejercicio que hemos hecho tanto en Argentina como en Guatemala respecto de esto. Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente. Nosotros pensamos que si en Argentina modificamos el impuesto a la propiedad inmueble, el impuesto a las grandes fortunas y un porcentaje de la evasión de impuestos que tenemos en nuestro país, podríamos aumentar la inversión en educación un 2% del PBI en Argentina y un 1% del PBI en Guatemala. Simplemente tocando el impuesto a la propiedad y el impuesto a las grandes fortunas. impuestos o sectores que no están siendo grabados hoy. Y eso aumentaría 40% del presupuesto de educación, 34% en Guatemala, 41% en Argentina. Voy rápido porque ya me pasé un montón. Siguiente, por favor. Hay dos alternativas para salir de esta trampa de la austeridad. Una técnica y una política. La técnica, ¿hay que mejorar la progresividad de los sistemas tributarios? Sí. ¿Hay que aliviar la carga de los que menos tienen para que paguen los que más tienen? Sí. ¿Hay que recuperar recursos que hemos perdido por maniobras de evasión e ilusión? Sí. Bueno, esas son alternativas técnicas, ¿no? Es posible llevarlas adelante con alguna norma, cambiar alguna ley, pero hay después, siguiente, alternativas políticas, que son en las que nos tenemos que centrar. Hay que generar cooperación en materia tributaria en América Latina, a través de un organismo supranacional. Tenemos que insistir en la Convención Fiscal de Naciones Unidas. Tenemos que cerrar las guaridas fiscales. Hay que cerrar las guaridas fiscales definitivamente. Hay que poner fin al secreto fiscal. Hay que generar un registro global de beneficiarios finales, de empresas, de bienes, de activos. Saber quién es dueño de qué y en dónde. Siguiente, por favor. Creo que es la última. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Disculpen pasé unos minutos, pero quería contarles bien cuál es la realidad latinoamericana y cuáles son nuestras expectativas de aquí al futuro. Ahí pueden ver los logos de todos los miembros de la Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you so much, Adrián. It's okay, I let you talk a little bit longer because unfortunately we had some dropouts. But I see that Farooq has just joined us. I'll come back to him in a bit. But before we move to Farooq, I'll ask Thais to upgrade Caroline, our colleague from GATJ. Caroline will be stepping in for Francis, who is unfortunately unable to join. And she will give us very briefly some remarks on what tax and gender priorities are for a recovery from the pandemic that doesn't pass through austerity. So Caroline, Lais.
Âurea, I'm not sure if she's connected. Maybe she had some internet connection problems too. So maybe we could start with Farooq, if that's fine.
That's fine. Hello, Farooq, how are you? Farooq, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good
Can
afternoon.
you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you for joining us. I'll come to you now. Farooq is a member of Pakistan Kisan Rabita Committee and also a member of the Tax and Fiscal Justice Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. Farooq, over to you to tell us in some top line comments how the situation in Pakistan has come to be. What has the role of regressive taxation policies and more broadly of austerity policies in the making of this crisis, and what are the alternatives that are being considered by the movements on the ground and the organizations on the ground to push against to push for recovery, but a recovery that doesn't include austerity. So over to you, Farooq. Thank you.
Thank you. I have just come out of a rally. That's why I'm sitting in a car to join you. This rally is a climate justice rally in Lahore. And I just spoke in the rally about the recent floods and torrential rains and the impact that had on the lives of ordinary people, and also spoke about the tax justice and also the way regime is dealing and IMF and World Bank are dealing Pakistan at present time. So I'm sorry, I'm not really in a room, but sitting in a car to join this this meeting now. So I would say that Pakistan is one of the country which has raised taxes again and again during the past few years, particularly the present government, which has come into power a few months before. In April, they came into power after 4 years of Imran Khan's government. This government is also on the same path. They are increasing taxes. They are increasing the prices of everyday goods. And they are particularly increasing the prices of electricity, gas, and other other items and oil to an extent that people have really been saying that we have never seen a government which has raised so much taxes and so much prices in short period of time. And they say we don't want to be Sri Lanka and we want to avoid that situation. So instead of putting the pressure, a burden, the economic pressure on the shoulder of the rich, who has unprecedented profits in the past, they have opted to put all pressure on the shoulders of ordinary people. And at a time when most of the people are underwater, and we had some historic floods and torrential rains. 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater at one time, and still thousands and thousands of people are on the streets. But we don't see any sort of concession by the government. Electricity is again becoming more expensive. The reason is they say that IMF loan has to be returned, and that's only possible when we raise the taxes. So instead of raising the taxes, who should pay the tax? They are targeting indirect taxation on the shoulders of the ordinary people. So it's electricity, it's the oil, and it is general taxation which they are raising, indirect taxation they are raising, and they are sort of unprecedented price hike at present time in Pakistan. For instance, the petrol price, we have never seen so much price hike of the oil, and they always say it's the international prices and we have to go along. But that was not the case. They have gone beyond that and they have put a lot of new taxes. And there are different names of taxes, levies, excise duties. So we say anything we pay is a tax. It's a tax we have to pay all the time. And it is a historic price hike at present time. Oil has gone up from 200 rupees a liter. The cooking oil I'm talking about. The cooking oil from 200 rupees a liter to over 580 rupees a liter. So you can see that it's nearly $2.50 a liter, a kilo at this time, the price of oil, because that is the place they can maximum put indirect taxation on the shoulder of the people. So is the case of electricity. And electricity has become very expensive. And so is the case of gas. So whatever is possible, they are putting taxation. And when they tried to put taxation on the rich, they went on strike and the government has to bow down immediately. So it's the ordinary people who are paying the price of this tax burden. And people are realizing that this is not our government. Even in this time of disaster, when 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater, taxation is still going on. There is no remedy. Petrol, for instance, oil, is becoming expensive every 15 days. And we know the prices internationally go down. Still, they put some levy, some tax. So they have new names, levy, and something like that on different prices. And that's how they are collecting funds. And what they say, we are trying to avoid a Sri Lanka-like situation where we would not go bankrupt as the Sri Lankan government declared. So what we say, don't pay, won't pay. We are not able to pay the tax, so we should not be levied all these tax. And people are really fed up of all these taxations which they are carrying out at present time in different sort of items. And also, they are allowing the rich a lot of tax exemptions, but it's not the ordinary people which are subject to any tax reliefs. So it's always the rich people. So for instance, the government announced almost 2,560 billion rupees concessions to the rich class. It never happened before earlier. And it's the ordinary people who are paying all the prices. So rich are getting tax reliefs, tax rebates, tax holidays, and they say, we can't pay. So government is a class government. It's a government of a class. It's a ruling class. It's the rich who are in power. It's ordinary people who are paying the price of the rich people. So you see a huge difference in the lives of the ordinary people. We have one side who are not earning $1 a day, and we have on the other side who are earning billions of rupees every day. So you see a maximum gap among rich and poor because of this tax policy. We want tax justice. We want a tax amnesty, and we want that government should impose tax on those who can pay the tax, not on ordinary people, not indirect taxation, not like general sales tax and these indirect taxation, which has become the main source of income of the government. So direct taxation, they always say, no, people can't pay. But indirect taxation, every 15 days, oil price is raised, and every month, the electricity price is raised. Every month, the gas price is raised. So we only hear the price, what has been raised. We have no say in determining the prices of electricity, determining the prices of oil, determining the price of the gas. That's the main consumption of the ordinary people in Pakistan. So we say rebel, resist, and fight back. We have no other option, but we have to say we will not pay these taxes. And we are campaigning at this time. I'm just outside a public rally. I just spoke in that rally where about 2,000 ordinary working class are there, demanding climate justice. They are demanding climate justice. They are demanding that government should ask the rich to pay, not the poor to pay at this time. And people are jubilant. They are raising slogans. And I was really reminded by a friend that you have to go for this tax debate. So I just came out of the rally. So I can show you maybe on the other side, you can see some of the flags. So this is the Punjab Assembly. So it's a Punjab Assembly. On the other side, I'm sitting just next to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Farooq, and thank you for coming us straight from the field of the front line of the battle for tax and gender and climate justice. I think this is the kind of energy that the festival needs to connect the struggles that are often put, as struggles of policy. But as Adrián very rightly said, these are technical struggles, but also political struggles. And the history will tell us these political struggles are won by movements and on the streets. So thank you. And I think it was an important, and I was trying to weave in also what Adrián said with what you said, this connection between the burden of austerity that is put on the poor through indirect taxations, whereas the rich companies and high net worth individuals are largely exempt from paying profit taxes, property taxes, or even wealth taxation. So I think what we are getting from you in Pakistan and from the presentation of Adrián from Argentina and Costa Rica is that across our world, and particularly in our countries in the global south, we have highly unequal tax structures, and this burden is being carried by the poor, is being carried by the particularly poor countries that are really at the forefront of the climate crisis, like they were at the forefront of the COVID crisis. I want to move swiftly to Caroline. Caroline Otim is Policy Advocacy and Campaigns Coordinator at the Global Alliance for the Tax Justice. She leads the Tax and Gender Working Group. Thank you, Caroline, for joining us very last minute. We're seeing you sideways, so if we can move, you're welcome. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us sideways. So Caroline, I want to ask a question for you to build on what Adrián and Farooq have been saying about the impact of indirect taxations on women particularly, but also if you can bring the perspective of women in Africa, which is the voice that we are missing currently on the panel, based on the evaluations and the study you have led with the Framing Feminist Taxation work. So what are the trends that we are seeing in terms of tax injustice, and what are the prospects of, or what are the demands of feminist movements and women's organizations for tax justice with a feminist lens to be present in the push against austerity? So over to you, Caroline.
All right. Thank you so much, Âurea, for the invitation. Unfortunately, my internet is so patchy and unstable. Allow me to turn off my camera as I speak. And you raise a very important question, Âurea. The fact that at this time and age, when you look at women's rights, when you look at gender equality, it will take ages for that to be achieved. And even the 2030 SDG agenda is something that will be a mirage if critical action is not taken at this point. It's important that the current economic and tax architecture is reformed to ensure that at the end of the day, they are gender responsive and they respond to the needs of both men and women, because historically, particularly, women have been disenfranchised by the economic and tax system. The neoliberal system, the patriarchal system have continually oppressed women, leading to their marginalization and exclusion in the critical conversation on tax formulation, on macroeconomic policy formulations. So I think at this time, this is a critical juncture where we really need to contribute to the conversations, we need to contribute to the discussions, to really put the agenda of the role of taxation for gender equality and for achieving women's rights. The Global Alliance runs a campaign dubbed Make Taxes Work for Women. And over the years, we have called on governments to really look at ways that they can be able to make tax systems more gender responsive. We have done this through 5 key demands, and if I may just mention them. Number one is that governments, it's important for governments to be able to ensure that tax systems recognize, reduce, and redistribute care work. And given the COVID pandemic, it has revealed how much economies are upheld by the unpaid labor of women and girls across the world. When we went into lockdowns and restrictions, it's women who, at the end of the day, really shouldered the burden of the care work. Beyond that, it's also important for governments to really look at putting in place progressive tax systems and to do away with regressive tax systems. For instance, the VAT, looking at joint filing of tax returns and other tax provisions in national tax laws that have explicit and implicit biases towards women. Really, those need to be reformed, to be repealed in certain instances, to ensure that we have more progressive tax systems that really benefit both men and women. It's also important for governments to ensure that at the end of the day, there are gender impact assessments of any tax law that is put in place. This will allow for governments to have a prior understanding of what implications, gendered implications, the tax laws or the proposed tax policies would have for both men and women. And by doing that, they would be able to ensure that their tax system is quite gender responsive. The other element, and this, of course, I'd also want to bring in the element of reforms within the global tax system around the push for a global tax body and ensuring that feminist voices and feminist analysis are part of that conversation. Âurea, you remember earlier this year,
Is it just me?
for tax justice. Hello?
Yeah, Caroline, we lost you at when you were trying to recall me of some event.
Okay, all right. Sorry again, my internet. I hope you'll be able to hear me. So I was just pointing out that in April of this year, African Ministers of Finance and Economic Planning, can you hear me?
Yes,
all right.
we can.
Okay, perfect. So African Ministers of Finance and Economic Planning endorsed a resolution calling on the UN to start negotiations for a UN tax convention. And as such, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, together with our regional networks in Africa, Tax Justice Network Africa, Red Justicia Fiscal in Latin America, as well as our colleagues in Asia, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, TAFJA, really have been running a campaign to support this call, for a UN tax convention. And this has been a long time coming. Over the years, we have seen declarations and positive responses, particularly from African ministers, for calling for the United Nations to really ensure that negotiations are held under its auspices on international tax matters. And so this is an important element, particularly because countries around the world, in the global south, Africa is losing hundreds of billions of dollars every year due to the large-scale international tax dodging. And the impacts of this are enormous for gender equality, for women's rights. I cannot really get into, all the different elements, but for gender equality and for women's rights, this implication is dire, because at the end of the day, governments miss out on the critical resources to fund their public budgets, and the social services that really go a long way to improve the position and the strategic needs of women really are underfunded. We also see situations where, for instance, governments resort to austerity measures, governments resort to budget cuts, and at the end of the day, it's the public services that really are starved of, the requisite resources so that women can be able to benefit. So based on this campaign that has been run by TJNA, TAFJA, RJF, and the global under the Global Alliance umbrella, really is calling for the UN convention to be put in place, that we all support this UN tax convention proposal that is out there. And this proposal, as I've said, it responds to a number of very strong concerns that have been raised before regarding the existing international tax systems. And therefore, it's something that really has been through a very consultative process. Civil society organizations are part of these discussions. We see quite a number of awareness raising events happening. So really, it's important for us to be part of that conversation. And I think as of yesterday, when the statement was officially being launched, we had over 300 signatories to this particular statement. So it really is a recognition that there needs to be significant changes within the international tax governance, and that really then it's a commitment, it's a global commitment for human rights, for equality, for environmental protection, and more importantly, for the sustainable development goals. Maybe I stop there, Âurea, and I hand it back to you.
Amazing, Caroline. Thank you so much, and particularly thank you for bringing such sharp points at the top of at the last minute. It's really remarkable, and I think you put us in a very good segue to then open to the audience. If you have any questions, any comments, whatever you would like to submit, please let us know in the chat. we can perhaps open your mic if you'd like to, microphone if you'd like to make a voice submission instead of written. I'll give maybe a couple of seconds to see if anyone is interested. You can make comments on the chat or on the Q&A. It's okay, we can pick both. Or you can raise your hand and we'll open your microphone. Anyone? Okay. I don't see anyone for now. So let me go back to Adrián. Adrián, is there anything else you'd like to contribute, having heard from Farooq, having heard from Caroline about how these agendas come together, and particularly how do the next months look like in terms of advocacy and campaigning? What are the opportunities and the challenges? Given that we already know that austerity is not something that is going to happen in the future, something that is happening now, and it's going to aggravate very soon, because the current estimates are based on IMF lending agreements, and we know that countries are going to be facing this reality from today, actually aggravating in the next 2 years. So what is the kind of organization that is being done in Latin America to counter that? What is the kind of organization that is Latin American movements are involved at the regional and global level to push against this onslaught of austerity? And what would you hope would come from a space like this? It's a mouthful, but you can pick what you choose.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Âurea. Yo quería plantear como 4 puntos, ¿no? Después de escuchar a los compañeros y las compañeras. Primero, romper quizás esta falsa homogeneidad del sur global. Somos absolutamente heterogéneos, somos diversos, somos diferentes, y eso es lo más lindo y destacado de esto. Entonces, primero tenemos que comprender qué nos ocurre a nivel nacional para después poder trasladar eso a nivel regional y después trasladar eso a nivel global. Si entramos por lo global, vamos a tener dificultades para llegar a lo nacional, porque en muchos países las urgencias no tienen que ver a veces con las agendas globales. Si bien nosotros desde la Global Alliance for Justicia, también la Coalición por la Transparencia Financiera, trabajamos en un plano desde lo global, hay un reclamo muy fuerte de las organizaciones por lograr que se entienda qué ocurre a nivel nacional con estos problemas de austeridad, con la regresividad de los sistemas tributarios, con el aumento del precio de los alimentos, y ahí hay un punto central que es quitarle impuesto a los alimentos para que sean de más fácil acceso. Bueno, toda esa problemática hay que trabajarla. Primero eso, abandonar la falsa idea de la homogeneidad del sur global, porque no existe como tal. Después creo que hay un problema muy serio a nivel de transparencia tributaria, transparencia financiera. No estamos avanzando en eso, estamos avanzando muy poco. Los intercambios de información tributaria entre países están funcionando, pero las administraciones tributarias no están teniendo ni la capacidad técnica ni tecnológica de poder revisar rápidamente esa información. Y eso genera que dinero que está alojado de latinoamericanos en paraísos fiscales termine después yéndose a otras jurisdicciones ante la alerta del intercambio de información. Y otro tema central, Estados Unidos. Estados Unidos no firma intercambios recíprocos de información con ningún país. Bueno, debería comenzar a hacerlo, porque gran parte de la riqueza latinoamericana está en los Estados Unidos. Y está en los Estados Unidos porque ha salido de Suiza, ha salido de los paraísos fiscales que están en el marco del Reino Unido y han recalado en los Estados Unidos. Bueno, Estados Unidos tiene la obligación, hasta moral, de intercambiar información con países latinoamericanos, información fiscal y financiera. Después creo que hay 2 organismos que son parte del problema, que son el FMI y el Banco Mundial. Y esto hay que decirlo con absoluta claridad. El FMI solamente encuentra respuestas si hay endeudamiento mediante. O sea, las respuestas del fondo es más deuda. La respuesta del Banco Mundial es más ajuste. Entonces tenemos que, desde el sur global, empezar a introducir nuestros temas en esos organismos internacionales, democratizarlos, ir camino hacia organismos que nos representen, como fue en algún momento el Banco del Sur en América Latina, que era un banco de fomento, un banco de inversión, un banco que apostaba al crecimiento de la región. El FMI no apuesta al crecimiento de la región latinoamericana. Y lo que hoy es el Fondo Monetario es un lavado de cara simplemente, pero sigue siendo el mismo Fondo Monetario, que la solución que encuentra es más deuda, más sujeción de los países, más ajuste estructural del gasto, porque la propuesta del fondo, por lo menos en el caso de América Latina, es ajuste del gasto. Y hoy estamos hablando de no hay que ajustar el gasto, todo lo contrario. Y por último, en América Latina se están llevando adelante, por lo menos en debate, 2 reformas tributarias que tienen un carácter absolutamente progresivo, tanto en Chile como en Colombia. De hecho, el gobierno chileno va a destinar el 60% de la inversión social a la renta universal en ese país. Esas son las medidas a las que hay que ir. Reformas tributarias progresivas, renta universal. No es posible que América Latina tenga 30% de pobres, que tenga casi un 15% de gente en la pobreza extrema. Es inaudito, porque en la misma foto salen los 1.000 millonarios que no pagan impuestos y que se enriquecen minuto a minuto. Estamos hablando acá, y Jeff Bezos es más rico hoy, ahora, de que cuando empezó este panel. Es increíble. Su riqueza ha aumentado exponencialmente sin hacer nada. Y la pobreza también ha aumentado exponencialmente y los gobiernos no hacen nada por frenarlo. Como decía en mi intervención, hay alternativas técnicas, pero que requieren fuertemente de un compromiso político serio a nivel regional. Tenemos que caminar hacia una convención fiscal también en América Latina, discutir gobierno a gobierno, palmo a palmo, cuáles son las medidas urgentes que tenemos que tomar en cada uno de nuestros países para resolver el problema, para resolver el enigma de la desigualdad, que no es ningún misterio por otro lado. Es cobrarle a los que más tienen, redistribuir mejor esa riqueza, para terminar de una vez por todas con la desigualdad y la pobreza. Es inaudito, repito, que América Latina tenga un 30% de pobres, realmente.
Gracias, Adrián. Caroline, any last words? You're on mute, Carol. Okay, I'm not sure if we still have Carol. But we have a question here from Gustavo Zulu, and maybe Adrián, you can pick up since Caroline seems to have dropped. And the question is, considering that a large part of the foreign exchange earned by countries of the global south comes from agricultural commodities, and that at the same time, rural oligarchies are at the center of institutional power, how to face the low taxes levied on large rural properties and the deficient inspection that allows large landowners to not pay taxes. Finally, in your opinion, how important is tariff structure that transforms large rural properties into major contributions to social policies?
A ver si entendí bien, porque no llegó muy bien el audio, pero en primer lugar, en América Latina hay que diferenciar de lo que son los grandes pools de siembra, las grandes extensiones de siembra de grandes terratenientes, de lo que es el trabajo agrario de familias. Eso es en primer lugar, ¿no? No toda la tierra en América Latina está en manos de grandes terratenientes, hay una gran parte que son de pequeñas comunidades indígenas, que hacen economía social, solidaria, es casi economía de subsistencia, pero no son los grandes pools de siembra. Lamentablemente las tierras en nuestra región están asociadas a una evaluación mínima del costo de la tierra. Es decir, no se pone en juego cuando uno determina un impuesto sobre la tierra lo que genera esa tierra, en términos de lo que planteaba el compañero recién, de exportación de commodities. En el caso de Argentina, bueno, el caso de Argentina es, la tierra es muy rica, da muchísimos recursos, pero los impuestos que termina pagando los dueños de la tierra por la utilización de esa tierra es muy bajo. Entonces nosotros planteamos ir hacia un revalúo fiscal, no solamente de la tierra, sino también de las grandes propiedades, de los grandes inmuebles, que pagan en relación muy poquitos impuestos. Por ejemplo, nosotros en nuestras casas pagamos mucho más impuestos que aquellos que tienen grandes mansiones o grandes propiedades en barrios súper ricos, etc. Ah, ahí me están colocando la pregunta en español. Claro, bueno, lo que tiene que ver con la deficiente inspección era lo que decíamos al principio de mejorar técnicamente a través de formación, capacitación, entrenamiento, tecnología, a los sistemas, a las administraciones tributarias. Se está utilizando muchísimo, por ejemplo, el uso de drones, para determinar plantaciones, para determinar qué sectores están siendo utilizados como productivos y que no están siendo declarados al fisco. ¿Cuál es la importancia de una estructura tarifaria que transforme las grandes propiedades rurales en grandes contribuyentes? Bueno, muy importante, claramente. Estamos hablando de el impuesto predial, que en América Latina está subvaluado. Básicamente está subvaluado. Pero como decía al principio, hay un fuerte lobby para que justamente esa tierra que está subvaluada, esos bienes que están subvaluados, esa riqueza que está escondida, no sea grabada, no sea alcanzada por el fisco. Y no sé si ocurre en el resto de los países del sur global, pero esta alianza estratégica que tienen grandes medios de comunicación, que tienen intereses creados, porque gran parte de esos terratenientes tienen inversiones en esos medios de comunicación. Y lógicamente generan un contrasentido, un contradiscurso, que después termina siendo parte de la opinión pública, ¿no? Casi parte del sentido común, ¿no? De si le pagamos a los que tienen más plata, después no van a invertir y no van a generar trabajo. Ese es un poco el discurso que se genera habitualmente. Bueno, eso es lo que hay que desmontar también. Por eso decía que en cada uno de los países la realidad es muy diferente, entonces tenemos que entender la heterogeneidad de cada uno de los países y actuar en consecuencia. Pero de vuelta, ya vimos el ejemplo, que si en América Latina logramos grabar solamente el 1% del PIB regional, que es lo que representa de mínima el impuesto predial, que es el impuesto a las grandes extensiones de tierra, y el impuesto a las grandes fortunas, estaríamos recaudando cerca de 50.000 millones de dólares anuales, de mínima. Y bueno, esto se hace obviamente con voluntad política, de otra manera es casi imposible.
Thank you so much, Adrián. Muchas gracias. I also want to thank Caroline and I want to thank Farooq. It's very difficult to have all regions, all southern regions present because of time difference. So I want to appreciate Adrián for waking up early and being present here early. For Caroline for stepping in last minute, and Farooq for coming us straight from a rally, which is, I think, encapsulates the type of energy that the End Austerity campaign needs to carry forward. It needs to be a campaign that goes beyond the Zoom calls and the conference meetings to go to the streets, because these are demands for life and death and well-being for all of us. So thank you to all of you. I invite you to continue staying, Adrián, if you'd like. But now I want to shift gears and bring in our partners from Financial Transparency Coalition, particularly Matti Kohonen, who is the executive director. And Matti will do very briefly a presentation of the recently launched report on people's recovery, on recovery financing, which we'll talk more about. But this is, I think, the question here and why we agreed to have the report launched on this space was because as we talk about tax justice, as we talk about austerity, we are seeing that increasingly choices are being made about allocation of funds that are not the choices that are needed to be made to counter the crisis. And in particular, when we live in a context where citizens are permanently and constantly told that there are no funds to sustain social protection and social programs, but there are funds to bail out big companies, particularly in times of crisis, then we need to ask ourselves why that is and what are the specific demands that we would like to bring on the table. This is what the first report that FTC published help us see, and Matti will tell us about the second report, what new insights it brings, and what we can learn to strengthen our campaign, this campaign and other campaigns. Matti, over to you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. You are on silent.
Thank you, Âurea. Thank you to Adrián, Caroline, Farooq, for the great conversation already so far. I'm going to share my screen because it's a presentation about research that was launched this week, this Wednesday. It's the second edition of the People's Recovery Report. And this time it looks at a total of 21 countries in the Global South. The research was conducted through our FTC coalition membership. So in Latin America, it was coordinated by LatinDad, with participation for the Argentina analysis by Fundación CES. In Central America, it was coordinated through ICEFI. In Africa, it was coordinated by Tax Justice Network Africa, and in Asia through various members of the coalition in Asia, including CBGA and APMDD's members and TAFJA members. The recovery period from 2020 to 21 is an example of state effort in a deep crisis, and it shows what governments can do if they so wish, and what the response is when they act decisively. So we did see some very important recovery packages across the Global South. And we did also see that there's a huge variation in the effort of states to enable a just, a feminist, a equitable recovery if they have this fiscal space, if they're not under conditions from the IFIs, and if they have the political will to do so. In this graph, you will see the relative effort of states, which ranges from about 10.6% of GDP in Chile, which had the highest recovery spending over the 2 years, to and that's on 2 years of GDP, to the lowest being recorded in Malawi of only 0.3% of GDP in the case of Malawi, very closely followed by Nicaragua as well. It shows the difference of how states mobilize financing. What this graph also shows is that we divided recovery spending in 4 categories. We did the same categorization last year. These are based on government announced recovery plans that we then verified, and we checked also if some of those recovery plans were actually implemented. So we looked at social protection, help to corporates. Corporate help could be tax exemptions, waivers, loans, grants to corporates, SME stimulus, similarly grants, loans, but specifically to the SME and the micro SME sector. So when that was an explicit aim of the government to help that sector, and informal sector support. And we found overall that 38% went to corporates, so 4 out of 10, and the same went to social protection. So we often talk about the social protection as the stimulus, but actually an equal amount of what went to social protection packages, the help that actually reduces the incidence of poverty and reduces inequalities during a pandemic, went to corporates in various ways. SMEs received 20% in this study, and informal sector only 4%. And informal sector, of course, is where most of the employment in many countries in the global south find themselves. So that was the sector that was the least targeted. We can also look at the proportions of total stimulus spend, and here you see that the blue line is social protection. So you can see some countries' social protection was the dominant form of help. That included Brazil, that included Ghana, it included Guatemala. So countries that did social protection packages or cash transfer packages, they tend to have a social protection dominant recovery. This was most countries in the Latin American region, except for Nicaragua and except for Colombia's effort, which we measured was lower than others, but they did have a social protection package that was passed as well. But they tended to be quite short in terms of their duration. They were they varied from about 3 months to some having until 2021, the package is still in place. And that was the case in Chile, that also the duration of the package was the longest. And now, in terms of sufficiency, we would say that the UN Secretary General said that 10% of GDP would be what's necessary. So we could say that only Chile reached that level of adequate spending. And that can really compare also that it not only does it have to be 10% of GDP, but it also should be a package that's majority social protection, which in the case of Chile, we can see it is just above 50%. So we could say that that package might have been adequate. However, also in Chile, the rates of poverty did increase during COVID based on national poverty studies. So what we can say also is that the gendered impacts of recovery due to the large amount of corporate support may actually be negative for the entire recovery packages. The reason why I say may is that we don't have gender disaggregated data for most of the recovery spending. We only have it for a selection of the social protection packages. Not even every social protection package has that. And from the data on social protection packages and their gender disaggregation, mostly available in the case of Latin American countries, Bangladesh and Ghana, we can say that most of social protection support did go towards women, more so than men. Not in every social protection package, it depends on the type of support given. So where the support is given as a universal grant, that tends to go more towards female recipients who find themselves more in the case of poverty measured by income, whereas where it is given as salary support to protect jobs in a formal sector, that tends to go more towards men, except when it's a female dominant sector, such as the Bangladesh garment sector. Looking at corporate measures, if we look at ownership data of corporates, if we look at who owns companies, the shareholders, the senior directors, unless it is specifically targeted for female-owned enterprises or youth-owned enterprises, it tends to be going majority, the vast majority, towards men. In one package in Bangladesh, 6.2% only went towards women-owned enterprises. So these are some of the gender inequalities that are actually exacerbated by the recovery packages, even though we recognize the huge increase in gender inequality. Looking at the country level and taking a kind of a look at what happened, Chile did very large recovery spending and cash grants towards citizens who were most in need, and it lasted until 2021. And then that was worth about 31 billion in US dollar terms. Much smaller packages were made towards the corporates and SMEs. So those were sort of loan guarantees that Chile made to mostly SME enterprises worth 11 billion. And this was funded by taking on new debt and going into a fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit in 2020 reached about 10 or 11% of the budget. However, Chile had a change of government, and instead of cutting the budget, Chile is now planning to expand their tax collection by a total of 4% of GDP, noting, like Adrián said also, that many countries in the Latin American region, their tax per GDP ratios are much lower than OECD countries or European countries, and therefore there's scope to progressively increase tax collection. And this is being done in Chile through a tax reform that looks at wealth taxation, expanding the corporate tax base, and looking at other areas where taxes can be expanded, including capital gains. So that's a choice that the government is making to ensure that their budget deficit will be reduced. Now, Chile is also under the requirement, and this is where the IMF comes in. Chile just a few weeks ago agreed to a flexible credit line worth $18 billion from the IMF. And I quote, if you look at the letter of intent for this agreement, it says that it's anchored in long-standing structural fiscal balance rule, which means that it's a law which says that you have to balance your budget. These fiscal rules or fiscal ceilings or spending ceilings, in different countries, they have different names. They were suspended under emergency laws, for instance, in Brazil during the pandemic, to allow deficit spending beyond the fiscal rule, and many other countries, these rules were suspended, but they are now back. So many countries, partly due to IMF loan conditionality, need to reinstate their fiscal rules, and this is equated with fiscal consolidation. However, the way Chile is approaching fiscal so-called consolidation is by raising taxes on the rich. That's the right way to do it. Many countries, unfortunately, are going to cut public expenditure. Second country that we could really learn and study is the case of Zambia. So if we look at Zambia's spending, we have an effort of 2.39% of GDP, which is about average across the 21 countries we studied, which was 2.4%. However, the composition of the effort was that the vast amount of the financing went towards loans to corporates. There was a huge VAT refund deficit that the government tackled through a COVID loan. And we measured that only 21 million went to cash transfers, and the cash transfers were about $25 at the 2020 exchange rate. And it was for a period of 6 months. And there were a top up of some other social protection measures of worth 27 million. So if we look at the proportions of what we see going to people and what we see going to companies, VAT refunds went to companies, often mineral export companies. And also what we couldn't measure is how much was the cost of giving mining companies a tax break. That's not accounted in the budget. Often tax exemptions go unaccounted for. Now, Zambia, as we know, also has an IMF loan. This is a long-term loan, so it's not an emergency loan. And this comes with very strict conditionality. It will mean raising value-added taxes. It will mean cutting public expenditure, and the requirement to meet to reduce the fiscal deficit and to have a fiscal surplus. So Zambia is asked by the IMF to run a fiscal surplus this close to having the worst crisis in many years. So running a fiscal surplus is austerity because that's there to pay off the debt. The debt restructuring or relief that is happening as part of the package is inadequate. Especially the private creditors should take a much bigger reduction in the loan amounts that are restructured as part of the negotiations, but they are the ones who don't come under many obligations for any debt relief. Some of the other creditors have accepted a slightly larger debt reduction. But the most important thing would be to pass a progressive fiscal reform also in Zambia, and to ensure that the multinationals are paying taxes there. Zambia is a mineral exporter, copper being the main mineral export, but also other minerals are being exported. In a third country, just to compare and to complete the round of comparison, is Bangladesh with a 4.5% of GDP recovery package over the 2 years. But here again, the vast majority, around 66%, went to corporates, about 13.6 billion. And this was mostly for formal sector to ensure that they don't fall back on their loans. So the state sort of capitalized and gave loans to corporations so that they would not have cash flow issues because they suffered a big drop in the exports and they suffered a big drop in the economy. So they saved the private sector with far more money than the approximately 1.9 billion that was put into various social protection programs that was measured here. So there was an important proportion of social protection, but it was nowhere comparable to the private sector support and the effort. And this is due to the limited fiscal space that Bangladesh has. One of the peculiarities of Bangladesh is to have a very low tax per GDP ratio and having a very low number of taxpayers who pay income tax or corporate tax. So it's an economy where even fairly large businesses declare far less income for tax purposes than what they should, and very few of them register as taxpayers. So there's a gap in registering for tax and therefore evading taxes that they should be paying. And it's one of the lowest if you compare to India. The India's tax per GDP ratio is already 20%. There were some important donor-supported packages in Bangladesh, especially to export sectors. And here we did see that the garment sector had a wage support package, and this was inadequate as well because it didn't cover for all of their wages. And overall in the country, 65% of women, according to one survey, faced falling incomes. And this wage support package gave for a few months, about 60 to 70% of loans with the promise of wages, with a promise of not losing their jobs. There were concerns that these didn't always reach the female workers in the garment sector as the companies themselves withheld some of those funds. So there's an important aspect of monitoring whether the support in social protection, if channeled through companies and their bosses, actually reaches the workers. Also, Bangladesh is negotiating a different type of IMF assistance. This is called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And because it's a new trust, so this is coming about from when in August 2021, the IMF issued 650 billion in special drawing rights. Now, the distribution of special drawing rights is so that 60 to 70% of them went to high-income countries. So rich countries got most of the IMF free money, and now they are promising between 20 to 25% of that being channeled through the IMF as loans to low-income countries. So, and that comes with certain conditions, but because the loan agreement has not been signed, we don't know how harsh the conditions are going to be. But we expect IMF to also, in this case, as in Chile, and even more so in Zambia, to expect that balanced budgets and possibly a budget surplus will be demanded, unless the government does something similar to what Chile did in expanding the taxpayer base at the richest end and increasing corporate taxes. It may well become an austerity budget of increasing VAT and cutting public expenditure. Just last one, and this is what does a people's recovery mean? It means that governments tax those who've made money during the pandemic, whether it's corporate excess profits like windfall taxes, whether it's the rich who got richer, tax them via wealth taxes. Those should be the targets of taxation, and expanding the tax base at the top end where those are not in the tax system. Also, it's important that we reform global tax governance, like was said earlier in this event. It's important to follow the African Union call. This week, the UN Secretary General also called for a UN tax convention. It's important that that's followed, because the way we tax multinational companies is set by the OECD, and they mostly look after their own members, and it becomes a negotiation between the US and the EU. And the minimum tax rate needs to be far higher at 25 and distributed far fairer, among other reforms that are needed. In order to tax wealth and also tax corporates, we need ownership registries. We need to know who owns what. And it may seem strange, but we don't know who owns the shares of even Amazon, because those are not on a public registry. They declare that Bezos, of course, owns a large part of them, but we need to know the shareholders of all companies. We need to know who owns, especially offshore companies, where it's easy to escape taxes and hide ownership for various purposes, including embezzlement and corruption and financial crimes and illegal activities. So it's important that we create these public registries of beneficial ownership. One of the motives is simply to make procurement more transparent, so that we know who are those bidding for public contracts, who are those asking for mineral contracts, who are those asking for fishing contracts. Those should be on a public registry if you intend to bid for access to state licensed resources or state contracts. We need to use the money that we collect in universal social protection. Poverty is a crime. Poverty is a human rights violation. We should have universal social protection and universal basic incomes to fight poverty and to reduce gender inequalities through schemes that help those who are most impacted by inequality. And often that means women and marginalized populations. Universal social protection, according to research, goes majority to those most in need. So you don't need to target even. A universal package actually tends to go more towards those who are in marginalized situations. We need to reverse the trend of the last 20 years of falling corporate tax rates. To take an example, during the pandemic, Bangladesh retained a 15% corporate tax on the garment sector because there's such an important lobby. They were supposed to have the tax rate increased, but it was put on hold. Other companies pay over 30% corporate tax. It's important to take away some of these exemptions and to make sure that the rates of corporate taxes are adequate and that they actually are based on a country-by-country reporting, so that we know where the corporates are operating, so that we can effectively tax them. We should also be able to do better monitoring of these recovery packages. It's one thing to announce a package, but we also need to have better monitoring of the spending and the disbursements to understand if packages have actually been implemented, especially the social protection packages and SME loans where data was sometimes missing. Finally, but not least at all, is that gender disaggregated data is vital and important to understand the distributional impacts of public spending, and especially these COVID and other crisis packages that we see. If we don't have gender disaggregated data, we don't know who benefits from public expenditures and public policies overall. And in the case of the private sector, we need to do gender and macroeconomic analysis to understand when help is given to private sector through exemptions or through loans, to understand who down the line benefits from them, even if it's a legal entity receiving the loan. By understanding who works at these corporates and who are their shareholders, you can make an educated guess of who are the likely beneficiaries of private sector help. To understand that makes public policy a lot more legible for people. We need to explain public policies a lot more in basis of their gender impact, poverty impact, and also other categories that are relevant in every country, whether it's caste in South Asia or whether it's race in countries with racial disparities. So that's a people's recovery. Unfortunately, we are still having too much of corporate recovery, but a people's recovery is direly needed, not just for COVID, but for the current crisis caused by the war in Ukraine and because of the climate crisis that not least has impacted Pakistan very lately. Thanks.
Thank you, Matti. And that's a really good point to end on. At the moment where austerity is being pushed as the solution, and countries are being, in a way, forced to implement fiscal consolidation measures, we are still having a corporate recovery, a corporate bailout, and not a people's bailout. I want to shift to the audience to see if there are any questions or comments for Matti for the report. Before we go back to you again, Matti, if you have any final comments. I have my own questions, but let me be a moderator first.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat. Ladies, do we have anything? Is there something that I'm missing? Do we have anything in the general chat, maybe?
I don't think so, Âurea.
All right. Matti, a question that I had. Adrián, do you have a question?
Sí,
Go.
Âurea, sí. No, primero felicitaciones, Matti, por el trabajo realmente muy, muy importante. Nosotros desde Fundación CESI hemos hecho la parte de Argentina. Y el dato que sobresale ahí es la importancia que tiene los montos que fueron destinados a empresas, ¿no? Y la pregunta que yo quiero hacer es, si es que está en el estudio, por supuesto, porque en el caso de Argentina, mucha parte de ese dinero fue destinado al pago de salarios de los trabajadores y trabajadoras. O sea que no era dinero directamente a empresas, sino que era dinero a los trabajadores vía las empresas, para evitar despidos durante la pandemia. ¿Eso fue así en el resto de los estudios o los países que pudieron relevar, o hubo algunas diferencias, etcétera? Eso quería saber.
Yeah, Matti, can I add a question?
Yeah.
My question is if you have any disaggregation or understanding what kind of corporates are we talking about in each of these countries? Are they national corporates? Are they multinational? Where the facility is different?
Yeah, very, very good questions. I'll take Adrián's first. So I think in terms of the methodology, we allowed every country to try to see which measure is more towards corporate and which is more towards social protection and people. Actually, many classified wage support as social protection. And maybe we need to revisit the Argentina data still, because it's an ongoing project to see whether, if that actually went to workers and was not kept on the balance sheet of companies, if we should classify that as social protection measure. Okay? Because in Bangladesh, when they supported the garment sector, the big question is, did the bosses keep the money, or did the money go to women who actually work in the factories? And that requires a different kind of monitoring. It's quite a new type of social protection, to give money to companies that we expect them to give to their workers. There's a power relation here, because it's an unbalanced power relation between the boss and the workers, whether that happens. And the state should demand for that money to go to workers, or it should be withheld afterwards, because that should be a condition of that support. So I think we should revisit that and have a look at that. Where corporates received the funding for themselves, we take that as loans. And here again, the methodology is not, again, it depends on the country and the interpretation. Is guaranteeing a loan to a corporate a full amount of corporate help? Or is it just in case the loan is not paid and the state has to take on the guarantee and the risk? So again, some felt that we count the guarantees in full, and some felt that we only count if it has a fiscal cost. But I think the big question on the corporate loans is, did it reduce the effort on social protection by announcing big COVID packages that were actually loan guarantees? Was that done instead of social protection and direct help to people, or was it in addition? And I think here we still need to kind of look more into this and see, for those countries who did loans, could they have done more social protection? Because that has a much more direct impact in reducing poverty. Are they multinationals or national enterprises? In the countries where we have loan data, so not every country publishes the loan recipients, they tend to be national companies. So we see no evidence of the loans having gone to multinationals or their affiliates. Multinationals could well be shareholders of national companies. So that's very possible. But we don't see, let's say, a big multinational, a foreign multinational getting a loan. Where they did benefit is, let's say in the case of Zambia, where the mining companies, which are often foreign owned, there's one that is part owned by the state, but the foreign owned mining companies received a large tax reduction. So if you give a tax break, that goes to foreign companies equally as it goes to nationally owned companies in that sector. So the Zambia's case is quite regressive, and also it wasn't costed. So we don't know how much that cost the public purse. Similarly, in Kenya, there was a corporate tax reduction in early part of the pandemic in 2020. We're still receiving the Kenya's data to be included a bit later. So this will be actually a bit wider study. And it was a corporate tax cut that, of course, benefited most the largest companies who would have otherwise paid corporate taxes. Some of them did very well during the pandemic, especially companies in the food and medicine sectors in any way. So there are tax cuts, I think, are the most regressive form. It's even for the corporate sector, it's better to target those who would otherwise fail, but the state was too generous in doing blanket exemptions and too wide loans. Where it's more targeted, you could argue that in some cases, some corporate help might be useful if it protects workers from not losing their jobs. Yeah.
Thank you, Matti. I have another question. And in this report, you made a point in highlighting the difference, the situation of countries with high levels of informality. And I know from my home country, which is Angola, that one of the reasons that was given for not channeling recovery funds or initiatives to the informal sector was that it was very hard to organize, it was very hard to target and make those funds actually reach people. In your research, was there any clarity around the motivations for which government are channeling those funds primarily to corporates, or did you make any assumptions, or can you make any elations about the fact that these funds are primarily being targeted to corporates in terms of the rationale, political rationale, or even, I don't know, ideological, if you so think?
Yeah, I mean, the low amount of support to the informal sector, especially in countries where they're the majority workforce or even majority of economic activity, is a mystery, because that's where the private sector support should have gone. Some of the schemes for giving loans, they had categories of large, SME, informal. That was the case of Chile, where they disclosed how much went to each, and the majority in Chile went to SMEs. Why? Because SMEs have bank accounts. SMEs can access credit, whereas informal sector often either lack financial access in the normal way of bank accounts and published accounts that are a basis of giving credit. And therefore, unless there are schemes before the pandemic that target the informal sector, often in a sectoral way, like agricultural enterprises or fishing enterprises or enterprises in specific sectors that they already know are key parts of the informal economy, it was almost the case that no new informal sector support schemes were established during the pandemic. Some new social protection schemes were put in place, especially where methods of rapidly kind of creating social protection schemes existed. So these were cash transfer schemes that in some cases, either through mobile money, cash transfers, or cash transfers where the state had an infrastructure for some cash transfers, but they were able to scale it up for the needs during COVID. Especially, we saw that in Latin America and also in the Central American part of Latin America. We saw new social protection schemes of quite a large scale being established because they had pre-existing social protection schemes. Sometimes to prove eligibility, all you needed is an electricity bill that shows low electricity consumptions to prove that you are a low-income person, because you don't pay income tax, which is what happens in the informal sector. You don't have a salary receipt to show that you're poor. You have to show it through another way, such as low electricity consumption was deemed a way to access social protection in Guatemala for the bono familiar, which was a very big effort of social protection for about 6 months. In South Africa also, they created a new social distress grants that were really extensive, and they actually continue in theory until now. And again, South Africa will be included in the study later, because it's a really interesting case where the COVID grants have continued up until 2022, partly because when they were withdrawn in 21, that created riots and public unrest, which was partly linked to this, of course, partly linked to Zuma's trial, but it was partly linked to the rising rates of poverty in late 21 when the grants were withdrawn, and they were reinstated. But too little money was given to the grant funding, and Treasury by 2022 has now run out of the grants, and they're now protesting to reinstate them again and to create that grant into a universal basic income grant, which the civil society movements are proposing to be funded through wealth taxes. So there is a policy proposal that's quite reoccurring among the progressive civil society across the world to fund universal social protection through wealth taxes, through expanding the tax base on the rich, and taking into consideration some of the COVID experiences of some of the countries who maybe did a bit more than others.
Thank you, Matti. Thank you very much. 30 seconds if you have any last remarks, if you'd like. What would you like to take away from the report, and how does this weave into the task that the economic justice movement has ahead as we face this onslaught of austerity?
It shows that austerity is a political choice. It essentially shows, in most cases, you can fund social protection if you take away the giveaways to corporates, if you expand the tax base to those who are untaxed, especially the rich and large corporates. And therefore, the rising rates of poverty during COVID and now with other crises is a political choice. It's not a natural occurrence that poverty goes up when there's a crisis. It's a state policy supported by international institutions that cause poverty. Poverty is a political choice to a large extent, not just something that occurs if a GDP falls or rises. So that's the takeaway. And the takeaway then is tackle illicit financial flows through transparency and tax, tackle tax abuse, and create more citizen participation in defining recovery and other public policies. And if you represent all citizens in that dialogue, you're more likely to have progressive outcomes.
Thank you, Matti. Thank you. And you build on what has been said by the first panelist that came here. And all of this, to me, at least, comes down to the nearly 3 years into the pandemic, conditionality-based loans agreements and the sort of corporate bailout programs are making a return as the predominant policy and program alternatives offered for recovery. And this has been said various times over this festival. By 2023, 83 countries will have rolled back government spending below pre-pandemic levels, with as much as 64 countries poised to introduce aggressive fiscal consolidation measures. We now know that by 2023, 85% of the world's population will be living under austerity, and that a huge number of people will be put back or pushed into poverty and extreme poverty because of that. So by not just risking aggravating poverty, but also inequalities everywhere will get worsened. Human rights and development reversals that we've seen through the pandemic will become entrenched. And this will make it very hard to recover from the pandemic, the war, and the climate disaster, and the cost of living crisis that many people around the world are facing. And this all happens at a time where increased government spending in health, education, social protection is needed to usher an inclusive and just recovery. So we are here today in this panel and through Matti's presentation as well to show that there are alternatives, that there are choices that could be made differently. And those choices are both technical and politically motivated. From the tax justice movement, from the fiscal transparency movement, from the economic justice movement, the rejection of austerity policies as a means for countries to have macroeconomic stability is very strong, based on evidence from many different countries, but also based in the principal argument that governments shouldn't and the international financial architecture shouldn't put the weight on or the burden of coming out of the crisis on ordinary people. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying close to 2 hours. I would like to thank our interpreters, all of them, our panelists, and I would also like to invite you to continue engaging with the festival and also following the work of all of the organizations that were present here, namely Justicia, Fiscal, Latina, América del Caribe, Fundación CES, Latindad, Tax Justice Network Africa, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, Financial Transparency Coalition, and last but not least, the Global Alliance. Have a good morning, evening, afternoon, and we'll see you around. And end austerity now. I think that is the goal. Thank you.